So I'd like to introduce our next presenter. Exaria Zippel is a current dual master's student in both music performance and musicology at the Long School of Music. She received, get this, she received a Bachelor of Music in Performance, a Bachelor of Music in Musicology, and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Western Washington University in 2023. As a researcher and singer, her work has frequently focused on African American art song, spirituals, and Spanish art song and opera. Her previous lecturing experiences included her 2024 lecture for the Mukilteo Community Orchestra. I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly.
Mukilteo, you're very close.
And their concert Sweeping Forces, where she provided information on both Florence Price and her Symphony No. 3 in C minor. She's deeply committed to studying and advocating for underrepresented music and works to better understand what music means to people around the world. The title of Exaria's talk is The Underrated Ópera Nacional, an exploration of the dynamic and resilient Spanish Zarzuela. Please join me in welcoming Exaria Zippel.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for listening to my talk. I first want to start this off with what inspired me to explore this topic, and what I call a curious omission. Throughout my years as a classical musician and vocalist, one question popped into my head as I was studying in undergrad. Why is Spain never discussed when speaking about opera and vocal music? It was considered unique when I would perform Spanish art songs for my senior recital, even when Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States, and according to the International Center for Languages Studies, is the fourth most spoken language in the world as of 2024. Because of this, to me, it would seem natural that Spanish would be among the three most popular languages of vocal music: Italian, French, and German. But this is simply not the case. In the world of vocal music, Spain is often ignored, and other Spanish-speaking nations such as Mexico or Cuba are not discussed either. When I would ask my professors about this, they would never really have a straightforward answer for me. I particularly remember asking a teacher in my last undergrad seminar, which was not really related as it was focused on music in the Cold War, but we were talking about cultural diplomacy tours around Russia, around Asia, and around Latin America. And so to me, I asked the question to my professor, and I said, hey, why are we not studying this? Why do we not talk about this? And she was like, well, I never really thought about it. And so if, this professor of mine had a doctorate, she had studied for a long time, she has so many papers written in various articles. If she, even studying like various types of music, doesn't have an answer for me, how does that help me? And so doing some more research on the topic on my own, and not in school specifically, led me to discovering the subject of today's talk, the Zarzuela, or Spain's Ópera Nacional. So, what is the Zarzuela? The Zarzuela is a type of lyric theater commonly thought of to be like the German Singspiel. It combines both music and dialogue, which makes it a departure from other styles of theater and opera, particularly opera. However, zarzuelas do share a lot of traits with operas from Italy or France. For instance, to sing zarzuela does require a great amount of vocal training. Often many Spanish classical operatic sopranos have been featured in Teatro de la Zarzuela as zarzuela singers. And so it features, I'm not sure whether or not it's the same amount of training, but a great amount. It has arias, or what they call romanzas, which heavily focus on a character's feelings and emotions, much like German or Italian and French opera. And similarly, their stories, the stories that have been written for opera and zarzuela, follow a similar path from at first focusing on Greek and Roman epics, think like Orfeo and Eurydice, and a topic of zarzuela I will talk about later, El L'Oreal de Apollo, to more talking about common folk or working class people. Especially in Spanish opera, there's a great focus on the working class. And so they follow a sort of through line of grand epics to a little bit more grounded reality. Of course, there's smatterings in between, no matter which era of opera you look at. But this is nevertheless a commonality that they share. Despite all of this, however, Spanish opera is still relatively obscure to American audiences, and famous opera houses are no exception either. For instance, the Metropolitan Opera had staged their first Spanish opera in 100 years in 2023, with their production of Florencia in el Amazonas. If one of the most influential and renowned opera houses, not only in the United States, but in the whole world, can have a gap of repertoire this large and this lengthy, who is to say that it's not indicative of other opera houses around the United States? I believe there must be some sort of reason for this gap, and so therefore I will explore the genre's development from the 17th to the 20th centuries to see if there are any explanations for this mystery. Beginning in the 17th century, during this time, Spain was experiencing a lot of tension within its borders, as the Habsburg Empire, which ruled Spain at the time, was in decline. Of course, when you experience tension politically, it can pair off into different facets of daily life, and this included musically as well. Italian opera was spreading all across the country, while Spain itself was mostly focusing on creating spoken dramas. Because Spanish opera was constrained by royal politics in Madrid, a variety of plays were produced instead, with many of them beginning to use music in conjunction with dialogue. There were two types of plays that were the most influential on the Zarzuela, that being the Comedia and the Fiesta Cortesana. While they both used their music in different ways, they did rely on a combination of the two, and it was a stark contrast to the operas that were coming out of France and Germany around the same time. These plays are admittedly quite hard to access today outside of Spain, but they are still worth discussing as predecessors to the Zarzuela. First, I want to talk about the comedias. The comedias were created to fulfill a need that the Spanish theaters were experiencing as they became a necessary part of the economy. Due to this demand, there were constant performances, and then therefore they needed constant new plays. These new stories and new elements such as music were added, and thus the leadership of dramatist through the leadership of the dramatist Lope de Vega, the Comedia or Comedia Nueva was born. They soon became the dominant form of theater throughout the country soon after, and the use of both instrumental and vocal music for staging and thematic contrast was different from any other Spanish plays of the same period. The Comedia led the way for another type of play to be made, this time with more explicit Italian operatic influences and structures. That genre would be named the Fiesta Cortesana. The Fiesta Cortesana, or courtly celebrations, were a type of play that focused on creating elaborate stage productions for the royal family in order to display their wealth and to distract from the conflicts the country was experiencing. In the latter parts of the 17th century especially, King Philip IV invited and brought over Italian stage designers and engineers to the royal palace to create new plays for the royal court specifically. One of these designers, Baccio del Bianco, began to push for a mixture of Italian operatic conventions, such as the stile recitativo, a type of early recitative from Italy, and the lamento, which was a style of music focused on sorrow or grief, often featuring solo voice and basso continuo, with Spanish drama. The Fiesta Cortesanas were expensive and fanciful productions of typically mythological plots, but as time moved on, some began to feel the need to lessen the cost and make it so more ordinary people could also enjoy this new art form, and thus created the Zarzuela. Finally, we'll get to the picture. The first Zarzuela that was presented to the court of King Philip IV and Queen Mariana was in 1657. It was written by playwright Pedro Calderón, with music composed by famed harpist Juan Hidalgo de Polanco. That is the picture on the right, with the cover of the Zarzuela on the left. During the show's intro of the play, a young girl named Zarzuela would come out in front of the stage and explain what the play was and what it wasn't. She was quoted as saying, quote, "a little fable in which by imitating the Italian style, there is singing and acting. The name for the genre stuck and began to grow in prominence. Zarzuelas of this century were usually 1 to 2 acts and typically featured stories surrounding mythological settings and gods where mortals would speak while gods would only sing. Um, As was typical in Spanish theatrical tradition and was in stark contrast to operatic tradition during this time, women would play and sing all of the roles. It also featured less explicit Italian conventions like the fiesta before it, but it still utilized both instrumental and vocal music throughout the story. While this genre, it starts straight away from Italian opera, in latter centuries it would become influenced by it more frequently. But first, I would like to play a little clip of the first Zarzuela. Um, there you go.
No solo en ecos explican que aún con más demostración se alegran.
These are the gods singing. So as you can see, it incorporates a lot of fantastical like costuming. The stage design is very sparse, but it still speaks to the grandness of the story. This Zarzuela in particular, it's interesting with them. A lot of times I would find them on archive.org, but I would only find written portions of I wouldn't find the actual musical score. So I can't, unfortunately, unless I were to travel to Spain myself, I can't look at the music and say, well, this reminds me of this, or this reminds me of that. And so there's a obvious and clear accessibility issue in fully studying this music that will continue to be consistent as we come across the later centuries. Don't play it again. Okay. In the 18th century, there was the presence of foreign leaders in Spain, especially with the French Bourbon dynasty. And so because of that, foreign influences were heavily favored over Spanish ones, which led to Italian opera, again, being the favorite genre across the country. This favoritism quickly became dominant once the famous castrato soprano Farinelli visited the country, which caused Spanish theater, to be completely ignored. Due to the overwhelming presence of Italian music and Italian opera, it was inevitable that the Zarzuela would take some of those influences into itself to compete in this space. Again, while many of these are inaccessible or hard to find, especially their musical scores outside of Spain, it is still necessary to discuss the way that they were developed in this century. The early Baroque zarzuelas would use Italian-style arias and recitatives, like the Fiesta Cortesana before it. It would also use basso continuo, but despite this, there was still a clear feeling of Spanishness within itself, with some Spanish elements lingering in them as well. The way that dialogue and song were performed was in more of a Spanish style, like the works of Juan Hidalgo, like we just mentioned. The role of the characters, the use of Spanish dances and songs like the Seguidilla, and the fact that the actors were not primarily singers all sort of display how it maintained a Spanish identity despite still being influenced by Italian opera. Spanish composers and stage designers in the mid-18th century began to make a comeback, and they began to fight against Italian opera. The king and the queen were learning Spanish, and all of this allowed it to sort of grow in and of itself. Composers such as Antonio Rodriguez de Hita, that's in the middle, began to write and compose zarzuelas en masse, with Hita himself having wrote 31 zarzuelas during his lifetime. These are two examples to the left of the picture and the right of the picture. One particular example is the Las Seguidoras, that's commonly noted as like the first Spanish zarzuela that began to fight back against the dominant Italian opera. Um, in the 19th century, there was a lot of nationalism, uh, precipitating the First World War. Spain was not the political powerhouse that it used to be, and even within its own barriers, there were many disagreements between traditionalists and reformists, and of course, that would inevitably fall into various facets of civilian life as well, with the arts being no exception. As nationalism spread throughout Europe, Spain was not immune, and as such, the country began to reflect on what is Spain? What makes Spain Spain? Um, Towards the beginning of the century, interestingly enough, there was no coordinated move to create a national sound of Spain as opposed to like Germans, particularly focusing on a German opera or French opera in France. As first Spaniards were claiming Italian operas as the sound of Spain by the 1820s. However, there were several changes that caused Spanish composers to reconsider what was Spain's sound. There were changes to the patronage system. The church itself was losing cultural influence, and nationalism was still an overwhelming force in the country. The idea of having a national opera to finally get rid of, the domineering Italian opera and treat it as foreign began to take hold. And thus that began the search for the Ópera Nacional. The first aspect of this revival began with 1832's El Rapto, composed by Tomás de Novoes, with the libretto also being written by fellow Spaniard José Mariano Lara. This was in contrast to other previous centuries where there may have been a Spanish composer but not a Spanish librettist, or vice versa. So the fact that there were two Spaniards in both roles was really important. The piece itself was marketed as an opera española, and featured prominent Spanish melodies and themes like the Jota Aragonesa, a type of dance typically accompanied with music. That's the picture to the left. While El Rapto does contain a rondo theme and a male aria like Italian opera, Genoves decided to use melodies that were more like Spanish folk music rather than using bel canto or something similar to Rossini, who was popular at the time. In the latter half of the century, Spain experienced a revolution in its theater culture known as teatro por horas, or theater by hours, where several one-act plays would be played through the evening instead of one full-length play every night. That allowed people to come and go as they pleased and not miss too much of the action. Because of this, theaters became a center for Spanish composers who took full advantage of the opportunity and worked to create a Spanish opera or sound, and the zarzuela was their method of choice. Composers like Francisco Anseo Barbieri, the picture on the right, specifically worked to avoid imitating an Italian sound and instead tried to focus on defining what a Spanish sound truly was. He was not the only one, as his contemporaries Joaquín Gaztambide and José Nzenga were also credited with revitalizing the zarzuela, but the latter two were influenced by foreign sound, that being Italian and French light opera respectively, and that left Barbieri alone in having worked on a fully Spanish sound. Barbieri himself would go on to compose 77 zarzuelas during his lifetime, best known for Gloria y Peluca and Jugar con Fuego, respectively. But due to all three composers and their efforts, the Teatro de la Zarzuela was constructed in Madrid, first opening its doors in 1856. That was the theater picture that I showed when I asked what the Zarzuela was. It is the only theater to this day solely dedicated to the performance of zarzuela and operetta, which is an important note of just how prominent it was in Spanish culture. As an example, I would like to particularly highlight Barbieri's El Barbiero de Lavapiés, as I think it kind of exemplifies what they were looking for in terms of defining a Spanish sound. It was composed in 1874 and first performed in that same year. It is a contemporary of sorts to the Pirates of Penzance, despite the latter first premiering 5 years later. The music does appear to be inspired by some Italian opera and Mozart in particular, but this show has a strong Spanish identity from start to finish, with the libretto being written by fellow Spaniard Luis Mariano de Lara to the story taking place in Madrid in the 1700s and focusing on the working class people like barbers to the styles of dances referenced in the music and etc. Here are a couple of clips that I think display this topic well.
Buenas tardes.
Excuse me.
¿A qué merienda me haces?
¡Aquí hay atún frito!
¡Malo!
¿Aquí hay caracoles?
Cuernos como los que tiene el secretario de Estado.
¡Silencio, silencio! ¿Quieres que nos pongan a todos a la sombra?
No, por cierto. Pues si en España prendieran al que habla mal del gobierno, se quedaba sin base.
1 second. In the second clip especially, it shows them dancing to the jota, which I mentioned earlier, a specifically Spanish dance, which is a great departure from Italian and German and French opera, which did not feature frequent dance movements unless it was a particular show. But this was exemplary and common of the style at the time.
Buenas tardes, quedan tan solo...
Okay, the 20th century. There are two aspects to the 20th century I'd like to talk about, but first let's focus in Spain itself. When the 20th century began, the zarzuela was once again neglected, as Spain was experiencing a great number of financial difficulties due to its many colonies gaining independence. Instead of Italian opera taking center stage, like it typically had done, however, starting in 1907, English plays and the English language was taking the country by storm, becoming more both popular to the royalty and the middle class. The Zarzuela Infima focused on providing audiences with satire and more simple aesthetics, which was in great contrast to the drama and high aesthetic appeals of English plays. After the World War I, Spain was affluent and thus allowed productions for full-length operetta zarzuelas, such as those done by Pablo Luna on the left and Amadeus Vives in the middle. These zarzuelas were influenced by English music, but still featured Spanish drama at the forefront. While the country went through periods of poverty and fascism, the zarzuela was continuing its use as the national opera, being a symbol of national identity and pride. Another example I'd like to play real quick is 24 Horas Mintiendo, or 24 Hours Lying, from 1947 by Francisco Alonso. This zarzuela is a great example of how English music, to me specifically, I see genres like cabaret and swing jazz influence the genre of zarzuela. Dances like the foxtrot are mentioned and referenced, but also the xotis, a type of dance inspired by the Czech Republic, and the paso doble, a dance usually done by a Spanish military. Here are some clips. Sorry. Then
Me siento tan feliz que tiemblo de pensar que tú me puedas olvidar.
Yo te querré mientras haya en la vida un afán. Yo te querré mientras tenga perfume la flor de mi adorar. Mientras
no, that's okay. Okay. I know I focused a lot on Spain during this presentation, but I also briefly want to mention the presence of the zarzuela in the US and Latin America. There are many other places where the zarzuela was gaining influence in the 20th century, and those would be within Spain's newly independent colonies, and later the US. For countries like Cuba and Mexico, Spanish theatrical and musical traditions arrived through the colonists, but were then mixed with many of the country's own indigenous theatrical traditions. This would later spread to the United States, and there's a large Latine population, with cities like New York and Miami developing their own theaters and specifically performing zarzuelas. In the early parts of the 20th century, in the US, flexible programming across multiple states allowed both Spanish and Mexican zarzuelas to be performed alongside excerpts of French and Italian opera, especially when focusing on an audience made up of upper or working class Mexican Americans. And these performances would later influence theaters being built and zarzuelas often being featured within their programming. Nowadays, aside from countries like Cuba or the Philippines, who have created their own version of the zarzuela, in the US, the zarzuela has been relegated to small-time theaters. Two major ones in New York that are still alive today are the Thalia Theater in Queens and the Repertorio Español in Manhattan. Also, due to the advocacy and activism of performers like Placido Domingo, our organizations like Zarzuela in Miami and Zarzuela USA International have been created, dedicated to preserving this part of Latine and Latin American culture. Overall, to me, there are many reasons, and hopefully to you as well, as to why the zarzuela has been neglected, ignored, or omitted from vocal music and opera history. But I think that's a mistake to be corrected, and I'm not alone. When we wish to discuss the history of opera, we must do so holistically, and that means discussing every genre we can and on their own merits. I do think, obviously, as I highlighted, there is a huge accessibility issue that concerns especially zarzuelas of the earlier centuries, as many of them are not accessible unless you go to Spain yourself. And so I think there is in part work for Spanish musicologists and researchers to do to allow these works to become more accessible, as only then will we be able to greater understand both them and the genre as a whole as well. I hope I have illustrated to you just how dynamic the history of this genre is, and how despite its many barriers it's faced, it is still being performed across many countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Exaria. And does anybody have any questions for our presenter?
I see Louise Stein's article in the companion. She has several books as well. She's done extensive work on theatrical productions in Spain in the 17th century. I can speak mostly on the 17th century. But I think I would push back a little bit on some of what you started at the beginning, that I think actually, at least in the 17th century, people have talked about Spain quite a lot, and sort of some of the ways that it falls off the map later. I can't speak to it, but I think there's sort of two issues here. One is, I think, the main problem, if you want to call it a problem, with Zarzuela in terms of like modern opera performances and the interest of opera is that it has spoken, right? Every genre of opera that has spoken language in it does not get covered or done today, right? We think about English opera, the only one that gets done is Dido because it doesn't have any spoken language, right? Actually, John Blow has one without spoken language too, but no one does that either. But if we think about Singspiels, they're not getting performed, or if they are, it's amongst the words, right? So there's I would say that's sort of a broad bias of opera performance nowadays. The other thing I wanted to introduce is entangling the Italians and the Spaniards earlier on is hard, right? The Spanish own Naples. They are running Naples for centuries. And tons of music is coming out of Naples, and now we're like, oh, it's Italian music, but it's really complicated. And I know that distinction becomes, of course, we're talking over many centuries, and certainly later, right, there are these distinct entities, but I think, especially in the 16th and 17th century, it's quite muddy, and what people think of themselves, and part of the emphasis actually, right, is Louis XIV being like, no, there's no continental sort of musical style, this is French, right, and that is Italian, right, and so this sort of rise of the idea of, oh no, peoples will have their own styles, that's part of that, and so it's complicated, and in terms of the source problems, there are a bunch that have been transcribed. I'm sure you ran across some recordings about Antonio and Paris's beautiful zarzuelas, even with the speaking on the recordings, which is lovely. So there are some. It's also possible with a lot of genres that have mixed spoken and sung language. The music is incidental. It doesn't get published. It doesn't survive. It's sort of pastiches anyway. It could even be sort of contrafacta, right? Like we took a popular tune and we put these words to it. And so it's quite possible in many cases that music doesn't survive for these productions and they're hard to reconstruct.
Right.
So the one thing that just kept coming into my brain the entire time you were talking is there's a parallel art form in the British Isles that comes to the United States, equally ignored, minus the fact that there's a couple of scholars now who have really looked into it. But ballad operas are almost exactly a parallel to the Zarzuela.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if an avenue for you into looking more into this is looking at how did the ballad opera grow up? It just turned, we just don't call it a ballad opera anymore, right? It turned into revue, it turned into vaudeville, and then it turned into American music. So it became its own thing. But 18th century ballad operas have the exact same problem with not having any scores. Because the words were largely produced as broadsides. So I think you sort of answered your own question as to why they were sort of omitted, right? There's the geopolitical aspect, but then there's also, like, there are parallel streams in other locations that behave in exactly the same way. What I think is so interesting that I didn't hear you talk about, but I think would be a really interesting place to look is if it's the same, right? That there is this parallel. Ballad operas were the most popular entertainment in the British Isles. And it appears, right, that zarzuelas were these crazy popular thing. They just weren't the dominant culture.
Right.
So I don't know, I would point you to Susan Porter's work or Vanessa Rogers' work on ballad operas to see if you start seeing those parallels.
Thank you. I'm also writing down, so I hope it doesn't look like I'm ignoring you. So I remember.
So I wonder if you have any ideas about how in an environment like this, that you're in Vermont, how it would be possible to expose those?
I think at least I think to me there are some pieces of Zarzuela that are like readily accessible in comparison to other parts, and that's Zarzuela arias. Excuse me. For instance, in the music library, we have a collection of Zarzuela arias, and when I first brought one that I performed to my teacher, she kind of was like, where is this from? Or like she wanted to know more about it. So I think it's just putting one foot in the door of like a little stepping stone of if you perform a song by a work, people are naturally going to get more curious of like, where did this come from? Oh, now I want to look it up. Oh, now there's this thing. Oh, there's that thing. Let me watch this recording, etc., etc. As that's how I fell into this. I just happened to stumble across a recording of a Zarzuela, and I was like, what is this? And so I wanted to look more into it. And so I think it's really kind of fostering that curiosity. And I think also we do it a lot, especially in musicology, but sort of branching out of what you know or what's most familiar and like exploring what is out there or trying to answer questions that you may have that maybe you don't experience or it's not part of your culture or not what you're super familiar with, but there are answers out there. There are researchers out there. You just have to ask the question. That was a long answer, but encouraging performance, encouraging curiosity, encouraging later research.
One other question. You were talking a little bit about how composers were trying to deliberately find lines of Spanish. And I noticed in the clip from the Barbarillo, the use of the mandolin and strummed accompaniment sounded like guitars. Did you notice a lot of that?
Yeah, I did. There was a lot of guitars, a lot of mandolin, and a lot of like the Zarzuela that I found recordings for, or like there were recent productions for. It didn't. I think a lot of the Spanish sound was especially found in the instrumentation, as well as many other elements like the dancing as well. And so I think those were things that they really emphasized and wanted to focus on, as well as like the vocal styles that are, I guess, not necessarily unique, but when we hear them, we think of Spain or we think of Spanish culture. Thank you.
I'd like to